Hi everyone, this is Professor Fernandez. Today's lesson is about the elements of poetry. You have been learning lots of stuff here, more than likely about other types of writing. Today we're actually going to talk about poetry and essentially what these poems are actually saying. For a lot of people, poetry is difficult to understand because it speaks in metaphors and symbols, um, but is actually pretty dope once you get into it. So let's get started. Okay, for the lesson, you're going to need a couple of things. Definitely, you're going to need to have read the pages in the textbook that you were assigned. Um, Read those, get those out the way, and then come back to this lesson because this is just going to help emphasize some things that you're learning. You're going to want paper and pen for notes. Definitely take notes. I would not just listen to these videos and these lessons and not take notes. Um, and there's a reason why, and we'll get to that sometime during the semester. You would definitely want a copy of one of the poems that we're reading for this unit as reference, because that's just going to help with trying to identify some of these elements once we go through them. And then you're going to want to remember the rhetorical situation. You're definitely going to want to maybe take out those notes on the rhetorical situation. We're not going to go through one of the poems and do the rhetorical situation in this lesson. This I leave to you because you are learning the rhetorical situation. But it's very important to know that the rhetorical situation is used to find out the argument and how that argument has been constructed. Poems are no different. So when we talk about literature as argument, especially poetry as argument for this lesson, I want to go to a quote by President John F. Kennedy. He says, "When power leads men towards arrogance, poetry reminds him of his limitations. When power narrows the areas of man's concern, poetry reminds him of the richness and diversity of his existence. When power corrupts, poetry cleanses, for art establishes the basic human truths which must serve as the touchstones of our argument." This is a beautifully written quote. It's just gorgeous. And let me boil it down for you in case you're just like, yeah, okay, that's gorgeous, but I have no idea what that means. President Kennedy here was talking about how poetry and this written art, this written form of art, gets to the heart of what it means to be human and what humanity is. There's arts like music and painting and dance that talk and show aspects of humanity, but poetry really goes to the heart of an example of what humanity is and should be. And so there are two poets that I think do it fantastic, and you may have heard of them before. Biggie and Tupac. And I know what you're probably thinking. You're probably thinking they are not poets, they're rappers, but hear me out, you're wrong. Biggie and Tupac, if you look at their lyrics, that you see that they are actually poets. They have everything that's needed for the elements of poetry. They have rhythm, they have sound, they have meter, they have metaphors and similes, they have alliteration, they have allusions, they have all these things. Their lyrics are poems. Yes, they're poems set to music, but they are poems. And so their legacy to us is their writing. Yes, their music, but really their experiences set in poetic form. And these are the two best lyricists that have ever done it in the game of rap and hip hop, frankly. And so if you look at a Biggie poem or a Tupac poem, if you see um, if you see changes, if you see Notorious, if you see um, all their work, you can see everything that you need to for a poem to be a poem. And how it's put together is very methodical. And I could literally teach an entire semester on just their work alone. It's that varied and that deep. So I welcome you to look at their lyrics and to think about things like alliteration and sound and rhythm and meter, and understand how poetry is actually a living art form. So let's go through the rhetorical situation just as a quick review, because that is at the heart of this class and the heart of what we're learning here. The writer's purpose is, of course, who the writer is, maybe what they're actually having a conversation in with their work, looking at past work and seeing if there's any patterns, what topics that usually um, gravitate to. Then there's audience, and for audience, you definitely want to look for the intended and the unintended audience. The intended audience is where is the audience they actually intended to read or hear the poem. So you may want to do a little research. So if the poem was in a book or in a magazine, then you're going to want to know who the audience were, or was, I should say, for that book or that magazine. The unintended audience, of course, is always you guys, but there's also other unintended audience. Um, for, say, Biggie and Tupac, obviously their intended audience were people who were experiencing the same things that they were experiencing at the time. Their unintended audience is, the kids in the suburbs who are rocking Biggie and Tupac on the way to school, right? The unintended audience is the 40-year-old English professor who puts them in her poetry lesson. Well, actually, I think I'm more of the intended audience because I wasn't 40 when I when I heard them originally. But there's always an intended and unintended audience. Then there's topic. And topic, you have to think about as subject. What are the subjects that are happening in this poem? There's always more than one subject. And so really you just want to list this, you want to list the topics. And you may want to do a little bit of research of the topics if you don't understand what they are. And that's just going to help deepen your knowledge of the rhetorical situation and how the argument is made. Context, of course, is the background, what they're having not so much what they're having a conversation with, but what led them to do this piece. If they're having a conversation with police brutality, or they're having a conversation with motherhood, or they're having a conversation with womanhood, or they're having a conversation with masculinity, what is the context of that? What led to this particular piece? And of course, strategy. Yay, there's a star near strategy, because strategy is the longest step. It is always the longest step because you need to realize what you're actually reading. Are you reading a nonfiction piece? Then if you're reading a nonfiction piece or an essay piece like Letter from Birmingham Jail, that is an essay. Um, that's elements of argument. If you're reading a poem, that's elements of poetry. If you're reading something that it's like a story, has a beginning, middle, end, that is elements of fiction. So it just depends on what you're reading, but understanding what you're reading is important, because if you get it wrong, you're doing the elements of argument for a poem and you've missed an entire chunk of the rhetorical situation. So you want to make sure you have the right elements. And you want to make sure that as you're doing these elements of poetry that you are highlighting and circling things, annotating the piece. You want to annotate it, then you want to walk away, maybe watch some Netflix, come back and look at it with a clear head, and then do some more annotations. This takes the longest, absolutely the longest, and I'm not going to sugarcoat it. But once you have it and you understand and go as deep into strategy as you can, then how the argument is made and what the argument is comes much easier, which is why you want to take your time for this. So let me introduce you to the elements of poetry. It's speaker and tone, diction and syntax, figures of speech, sound, rhyme and meter, and theme. And we'll start with speaker and tone. And I'm gonna mention tone first because Tone is essentially the attitude of the speaker of the poem toward the subject. And I'm going to say the speaker of the poem, not necessarily the poet. Those are two different things. Just because the poet wrote the poem doesn't necessarily mean that they are the speaker of this poem or it is what they actually think. Unless your research through the rhetorical situation says otherwise, it's probably not what they think, right? So when we're looking at tone, we want to look at diction. And what diction means is that it's word choice, the choices of the words that the poet used to put in the poem. We also want to talk about persona. And what persona is a mask that the writer wears in the poem. It's not necessarily the writer. Remember, there's the speaker. So if a writer says, I did this in the poem, they're using a persona. They're using a speaker, right? A person who's speaking in the poem. They're using a mask to talk about things. So they're creating a persona. Of speaker and persona can be interchanged in some instances, yes. So here's an example by Claims by Judith Ortiz Coffer. And this is I believe it's the first line of Claims. Last time I saw her, grandmother had grown seemed like a boudoir tent. The I here is the speaker of this poem, and this speaker, this persona, is going to lead you through this entire poem. Okay, so it's not necessarily Miss Coffer who is speaking in this poem, it is her persona that is speaking into the poem. And I want you to understand that there is a difference, or not a difference. I want you to understand that the poet is not saying this. It's the poet's persona, or the persona, that is saying this. Then, of course, we have diction and syntax. And diction is actually just the choice of words. Again, it's one of those things that is used to try to understand the tone of the poem. And of course, syntax is the order of the words in the sentence. And that particular thing can add some emotion and some feeling. You understand things a little bit more. The order of the words in the sentence, or how a sentence is formulated in poetry, can be different than it is for, say, a short story or an essay. Maybe the syntax or the order of the words are put together in a certain way to emphasize rhythm, to emphasize sound or meter, maybe to put a little stress on an image. So all of that can happen with syntax. And I have a couple of examples here. From my father I take his brown eyes, the plague of locusts that leveled our crops. They flew in formation like buzzards. So this is from Inheritance by Linda Hogan. And this is an example of diction. This is an example of the word choice used by the writer, by the poet, to signify something. So we have the idea of brown eyes, and then the words that she chose, which actually are very interesting images as well. And we'll talk about images when we talk about figurative language. The plague of locusts, formation like buzzards, they give you the image of like death and destruction. So these brown eyes are being compared to death in this way. And because she chose locusts and buzzards, even the sound there, right? That alliteration there, kind of gives it a very sinister feel. Here's another example. This one by Inheritance by Linda again. So, or Miss Hogan, I should say. That tobacco is the dark night that covers me. So this is playing with syntax here, where she could have written this part of a sentence. It's not a full sentence. I believe there's a line break after this, so it's not a full sentence. Or at least it's a poem sentence, I want to say. That the order of these words isn't that tobacco is dark, like the night that covers me. It's that tobacco, dark night, covers me. And that order right there gives it a darker, heavier, almost sticky feel because tobacco is sticky, right? And nights can be sticky, especially in Houston when there's no air conditioning. Then, of course, my favorite example of syntax is Yoda. Do or do not, there is no try. Anybody who writes the script for Yoda in any of the Star Wars um, does have does have fun with writing Yoda. Fun they have. Have they fun? Yes, fun they have. So, and that is just a great example of syntax because the beginning part of what a typical sentence would be um, in English for anyone else in our language pattern is different for Yoda, where the beginning of that sentence is actually at the end of the sentence, and so that makes Yoda sound like Yoda. So let's talk about figures of speech here. So this is literally all the literary terms you have ever learned ever in your life. Simile, metaphor, personification, allegory, allusion, imagery, all that stuff is there. And this is like a building block or the scaffolding of the poem. Poems live and die by metaphors and similes and images and personifications and illusions. They live and die by this. This is the building block. Everything else gets added on top of this. But this is the building block of a poem. And so it's super important to understand the figures of speech of poems. Like, for example, this example by Legacies and this example from Claims. From Legacies by Miss Hogan again, it was like a brown cloud of grasshoppers. If I remember the poem correctly, I believe she is comparing skin to skin color, skin to color of grasshoppers. So she's making those comparisons, and grasshoppers are like really like if you ever can be dusty and really like kind of like vibrating almost. So she's comparing skin to brown vibrating grasshoppers. Um, so it's very like electric. Then you have Claims by Miss Coffer, who uses a metaphor here. She says, or her persona says, she carried 8 children, 3 had sunk into her belly, nafurgios. She called them shipwrecked babies. So she compares the 3 babies here that she lost in miscarriage to being shipwrecked into the deep, dark ocean and lost, essentially. So she is comparing these miscarriages, these babies in these miscarriages to being lost and shipwrecked. So that's a great metaphor. Here's another example of an allegory. And an allegory is simply, it's just a story that stands for an abstract idea or an event. The entire poem of Legacies by Nikki Giovanni is an allegory, and it's really talking about the legacies that are passed down from one generation to another and what the newer generation has to come into the knowledge of mortality and how things end and what it means for things to end in the context of them continuing on. So Legacies is a great example of an allegory. Of course, we have Symbolism also from Nikki Giovanni's Legacies. We have the roles here as a symbol of a bigger issue. I don't want to make no rolls. Her lips poked out, and the old woman wiped her hands on her apron saying, Lord, these children. So it's literally the conversation that's not happening when there's a conversation happening. So it's one of those things, we're talking about it, but we're not talking about it. And this is essentially what's happening here. So the next thing is sound, and rhyme is used here. We go back to Biggie and Tupac example. They used sound all the time, alliteration and assonance. Sorry, I trip on that word every time. Assonance. So alliteration and assonance are exactly the same thing, except one uses consonant sounds, which is alliteration, and the other one uses vowels, which is assonance. Let's look at a couple examples here. So A really good example is, I think, one of the very first lines of Inheritance by Miss Hogan. From my uncle, the whittled wood. That W sound is at the beginning of the word, and it's a consonant sound. So that's alliteration. If she were to say something like the obliterating ocean overwhelmed me. That O sound, that's a vowel, so that would be an assonance. Ooh, it's a really tough word. It's assonance. So I want you to know the difference. One is about consonants. The other is about vowels. So A, E, I, or U. O-U. A, E, I, O, U. So those vowels gives that, if it's repeated, that same vowel sounds repeated, is assonance. So let's talk about rhyme and meter. Also a favorite of Biggie and Tupac. We have the beats and the stress and the series of stresses and pauses on accents. And then the stresses, what they are is literally an emphasis on syllables. When you have that happen over and over in an interval, or you have it in a pattern, that's meter. So this is why you read it out loud, because this is not something that you're going to be able to see on the page. You have to read it out loud. Someone has to read it out loud to you, or you read it yourself. It's great if you maybe record yourself reading it. No one else has to know. You can hear it. Close your eyes and hear the meter, and hear the rhythm, and hear where the syllables are stressed. Um, this is like the very heart of hip hop here, the very heart of rap here. What is stressed, what is not stressed, the meter and the rhythm and the sound of the work. Here's an example. The entire poem of Claims by Judith Ortiz Coffer has rhythm in it. And the rhythm is that if you read the whole poem out loud, it moves like an ocean wave. So it's a really cool effect that she's doing there. And that's not something that you would get it if you read it just on the page, or if you just read it really quickly. You have to read it out loud and with purpose. And then you hear that um, this poem sounds like a wave. It goes in and out just like a wave, which helps extend the metaphor that's in this poem. So let's recap. You've learned a lot of things in this wonderful um, lesson. So you learned that poems are definitely arguments. I don't know how else to say it, but Biggie and Tupac have shown time and time again how poems can be arguments. If you don't believe it, please listen to Changes, Dear Mama, um, It Was All a Dream. I'm trying to remember the name of that song by Biggie, but it's literally, the first line is, "It was all a dream." I used to read Word Up magazine. That particular poem, read that, and it will show you that poems are arguments. The rhetorical situation, of course, can be used for them, and we're using the situation for everything. And then the strategy. So you know that if you're reading poems, you're gonna look at the elements of poetry, and that's what you learned today. The elements of poetry, and you also learned, hopefully, that poems are living, breathing things. They are meant to be read out loud. Do not read them just to yourself. Read them out loud. Poems live. They're alive. All right. I hope that this was helpful. Let me know if you have any questions.